Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards in the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Ambassador. This is a 3-cost action and attack from Seaside, and it says reveal a card from your hand, return up to 2 copies of it from your hand to the supply, then each other player gains a copy of it. So if you've ever seen a fairly new player to Dominion look at this card for the first time, in my experience they tend to be pretty confused. Why would you want to do the things that this card says, right? You take your hard-earned cards and put them back and then give them to your opponent. It doesn't make any sense. So Ambassador is a card that I think its value to you is not very clear upon first look. However, Ambassador is a ridiculously strong card. Even now, after however many expansions it's been, this is still in the top 10 strongest kingdom cards in all of Dominion, which is pretty big, right? It's all the way up there with Chapel in terms of raw power in a card. So historically, this has been alongside with Masquerade, jostling for the top place of the strongest 3-cost card in all of Dominion, ever since people were ranking the strength of cards from all the way back in, 2012? It's been known to be very strong, since forever, basically. It's very rare to find a kingdom that has Ambassador where you don't want to gain Ambassador and at least one of them. And usually that's going to be on one of the first 2 opening turns. There are many games where if you just don't buy Ambassador on turn 1 or 2, you just lose. And that's it. You've already lost the game, basically, because you didn't bother to buy Ambassador. That's how strong this card is. If I ever get a 5-2 opening and Ambassador is on the board, I will usually just buy the Ambassador on my 5 money turn and be pretty sad about it. But that's just Ambassador, right? You've got to pick it up. So that's the raw power of this card. So the main purpose in some ways of Ambassador is that it is a junker, right? Most of the time when you play this, you will be revealing bad or weak cards in your hand, and that means that you're going to be giving your opponent copies of bad cards. Now, most of the time this won't be curses, because Ambassador's not a curser. However, curses, I think, obviously people see the negative points and are like, oh no, that's sounds really bad. But the negative points from curses, while they are important, the worst part of them is the fact that they are just these useless stop cards. And coppers and estates are also stop cards that are very weak. They're not completely useless or negative, but they're really bad, and we consider them junk when we talk about getting junk out of your deck. So cards don't have to give out curses in order to be considered junking attacks. They can give out coppers and estates as well, and Ambassador is perfectly fine at doing that. Now, the point of why you want to junk your opponent is to fill up their deck with loads of very weak stop cards, so that they can't draw their deck, they can't cycle through it as fast, they don't get to their newer, more powerful cards as quickly, and hopefully it just stops functioning entirely. They can't draw together all their engine components, and just the whole deck falls apart. Now, Ambassador is a junker, and it only costs 3, so it starts throwing the junk at your opponent very quickly indeed. Now, there is a caveat. You do have to draw it alongside some junk, because you have to reveal the junk card in order to give it out. But, you start the game with 10 junk cards in your deck, so it's not very difficult to have junk in your deck to reveal. You're always going to have some, basically. Now, really important here, because Ambassador can reveal multiple types of cards, and those cards do go back to the supply pile, it sort of never runs out of junk. So when you think of a cursor like Witch, eventually that curse pile will run out, and then it stops giving out junk. But this isn't the case with Ambassador. It will just keep going and keep going. If someone gives you junk, you just put it back, and it goes back on the pile, and then it goes to your opponent. So the pile doesn't lower, especially in 2-player. Right, it just keeps going forever, basically, the junking. So it's really important that you get your deck under control and you try and keep thin when Ambassador is around, or you're basically never going to recover. right? You can't just say, oh, I'm going to eat all 10 curses or whatever, because you're actually going to be eating so much junk against Ambassador, like way more than 10 sometimes. So, your deck's going to get real bad in a hurry against Ambassador. So while junking is one of the strongest effects that you can really put on a card, junking attacks, trashing is another. Now, Ambassador technically doesn't trash, but we treat it as equivalent to trashing, because in most games, returning a card to the pile, it still gets out of your deck, right? And it has no other benefit most of the time. There are some cards where the fact that it's returning rather than trashing does matter, but a lot of the case, in most games that you see, you won't really notice the difference. So Ambassador, it's junking and it's trashing, two of the strongest things a card can have, and it's doing both of them. And as a trasher, Ambassador removes 2 cards from your deck instead of 1. So, sort of like Steward, that means that it's actually really good at getting you thin in a hurry. Trashers that only trash 1 card at a time, they take a while. So whenever you can remove more than 1 card from a single card play from your deck, that's usually pretty good and very fast. And all the cards that do that are usually pretty notable for that reason. So Ambassador's up there as well. Now, as I've said, returning is not trashing. So things that have a non-trash effect don't trigger. You won't get any tomb points, for example. In 2-player as well, because if you return 2 copies of a card that you can do with Ambassador, you actually cause the size of a supply pile to go up. So it's not uncommon in 2-player to end up with an estate pile in the supply that is actually got more estates in it than it started. So it normally starts with 8, but you can easily have like 11 estates at the end of the game. In very rare circumstances, and this is not something that you usually need to think about, you can actually repopulate an empty pile, and that can prevent the game from ending, for example. However, in order to do that, you do have to return 2 copies of a card, and then your opponent does get 1. So you'd probably only want to do that with something like curses, for example. If there was another junker out there, maybe the curse pile is empty, right? And in that case, you may be able to keep the game going or power down the city card, for example. But very rare that you see this. I wouldn't really think about it too much, but I thought I'd mention it for completeness. Now, as with all of these cards that do the equivalent of trashing, but they're not trashing, it bypasses possessions protection on trashing. And what that means is that if you have an Ambassador in your deck and your opponent plays possession, then what they can do is they can actually destroy your deck and get cards removed from it permanently when they possess you. And even if you don't have an Ambassador in your deck, as long as Ambassador is on the kingdom, if your opponent can get 2 of them and then pass one of them to you with their other one, you now have an Ambassador in your deck. So that means your deck is never truly safe, unless you have a bunch of lighthouses, I suppose. Or champion. Whenever you see Ambassador and possession, it usually means that someone's deck is going to get completely annihilated and all their good cards be sent over to your opponent. So all of your possessions, for example, they're the prime target. They all start leaving your deck and then you can't do anything. So it's pretty degenerate, but that's just how it goes with possession sometimes. Now, it's worth noting that because you are returning cards to the supply, some cards are not in the supply. They state on them that they're not supply cards, and Ambassador sort of doesn't really work with these cards. So if you reveal a non-supply card, it doesn't get returned to the supply because it's not a supply card. And your opponent cannot gain one because you cannot just gain cards that don't come from supply pile unless they're explicitly named by a card. So a notable example of this are Shelters and Heirlooms. These are cards that you can start with in your starting deck that are non-supply cards. They're not coppers and they're not estates. And Ambassador can't get rid of these. So the shelters replace your estates, and they just don't work with Ambassador, right? It cannot remove them from your deck. But this could also include like cards from the black market. If for some reason you bought something from the black market and you want to give a copy to your opponent, you can't, basically. But a particular edge case is that if you buy Patron from the black market, you still reveal it, so you still get the coffer, but then you don't have to return it. And maybe sometimes that extra 1 money might be valuable instead of junking your opponent that turn. So, again, worth noting, the shelters are really important to keep in mind, but otherwise, most non-supply cards are not things that you're going to want to be ambassadoring anyway. Now, it is worth noting, in terms of weird additional cards, ruins and potions are technically supply piles. So you can gift copies of those to your opponents. So potions can be like a junk card sometimes when they show up. So you can, if you've bought a potion for some reason, you can start giving multiple copies to your opponent. And then that's sort of another form of junk, basically, because they don't want that many potions in their deck. Ruins are a special case that you need to pay attention to, because if I, for example, reveal an abandoned village from my hand, then I can only give my opponent an abandoned village if there's actually one on top of the deck. Now in 2-player, I'm going to put that ruin back, and then there's one on top of the deck, and that goes to my opponent. But if there's more than 2 players, it may be the case that only one card gets dealt out, because the next card wasn't the abandoned village in this case. Sorry, not abandoned village. Is it ruined village? I can't remember its name, but in that case, only one player will actually get the ruin, and so you dish that out in turn order from after you, basically. It also means with ruins that you can't necessarily get rid of 2, because Ambassador only returns copies of the same card. So you can find that it's a lot harder to get rid of ruins out of your deck than curses when Ambassador is around. Now, it is worth noting that returning copies from your hand is actually optional, because it does say return up to 2 copies. And there are times when you want to play Ambassador and reveal a card, but not actually return any. Now, bear in mind that the gaining is not optional. If you have to reveal a card, and your opponents will gain a copy, but it's the returning that is optional. So what this means, sometimes you don't want to put the card back, so it might be that you've got thin and under control, but you want to keep a single junk card in your deck so that you have something to give back if your opponent didn't junk you on their turn. So in that case, what you can do is you can reveal it, and then you can just not return it, and then you've still got it for next turn. If you're really far ahead with Ambassador, something I've done is that you can buy a single curse, and then you can just start revealing that one curse and keep sending out to your opponent. And in that case, you won't return it until it is the 10th curse, basically. If the pile is empty, then you will want to consider sending it back. But otherwise, just reveal it, don't return it, and you can curse them every turn. Now, there are times as well when you might want to reveal a good card with Ambassador, and that is because it can really help you empty its pile. So the most notable example of this is a province. Why would you want to give your opponent a province? Well, if you reveal a province with Ambassador, you don't return a province to the supply, then your opponent gets one, but that actually lowers the province pile. So if you're planning to purchase a province on your turn as well, then that's sort of point neutral in the end. So if you're ahead, like say you're ahead and there's 2 provinces left and you're planning on buying one, well, you might be able to reveal another one, and then both of you gain your 6 points, but because you're ahead, you trigger the end of the game and then you win. But it doesn't have to be like provinces. It can be any pile, really. You can help lower engine components, for example. Of course, bear in mind that your opponent are getting a copy, but if you can 3 pile in this way, then it's going to be better than giving them junk that isn't really going to matter at that stage. It's also another example when you want to reveal but not return anything. If you have Throne Room or one of its variants, if you only have like one junk card, and you play Ambassador twice, you may wish to not return it on the first play and only return the junk on the second. That's so that you actually have something to reveal and give out on the second play of Ambassador. Now, you do need to pay attention here with ruins, because again, if you're not returning the ruin on the first play, it might be that there is actually no similar ruin on the pile to actually give your opponent, so your first play of Ambassador just sort of doesn't do anything. So do take care with that. It is also worthwhile sometimes, particularly after you've just started getting thin and you've only really got like a few coppers left in your deck with Ambassador, you don't want to return too many of them if you want to actually buy things. So the problem with returning cards that come from your hand, it's the same sort of problem that Steward has. It's that you sort of can't really afford very much if you've just gotten rid of a load of cards out of your hand by returning them, like coppers. And at some point you need to actually start buying things. So Ambassador is nice in that you can choose how many cards go, and so you may wish to still junk your opponent a copper but not actually return any, or only return one, and that is so that you can actually use that copper to buy something. Now, it can be tempting to get into the thought that you start preparing to say, next turn my opponent's going to send me a copper, therefore I'm going to have one more money next turn. But you shouldn't rely on this. I once had a game where I only had 2 coppers left, and I thought, my opponent will send me a copper next turn and I'll hit 3 and I'll be able to buy a silver, so I'm not going to buy anything this turn. And then they just stopped sending me coppers. Like, they noticed that I didn't have enough money, and so they just stopped revealing copper. And yeah, that was pretty silly of me. I had to buy a copper, and as soon as they saw me buy one, they started sending me more coppers again. So don't rely on that, right? You can't necessarily treat any incoming coppers as an income source. So you don't want to over-trash in general with trashing cards, but it's also really important with Ambassador, because you're potentially going to be getting coppers in. You can't actually rely on that. So don't pray and hope that your opponent is going to give you more money, because if they're paying attention, then they might not. So a question that everyone asks with Ambassador is, if I have multiple types of junk in my hand, like say I drew a hand of Ambassador, Estate and 3 coppers, what do I return? Do I return the estate, or would I return some coppers? So typically you would rather return 2 coppers in this case, because that actually thins you by more cards, and getting your deck thin and under control is really important. Of course, that's an overgeneralization. In reality, there's a lot of factors that go into this decision. So you want, with Ambassador, for your opponent to have a variety of different junk cards. That's because Ambassador only removes multiple cards if you've got at least 2 of the same card in your hand. So if you can be giving them like a big mixture of estates and coppers and curses, or like various ruins, then that makes it a lot harder for them to thin as many cards on their turn. So if you know, for example, that your opponent doesn't have any estates left in their deck, you may pick the estate. Similarly, if you actually don't have very much money left in your deck, you might decide that actually you don't want to remove the coppers in this case. Like, if these were the only 3 coppers left in your deck, then of course you would pick the estate to return instead, right? But the general rule with Ambassador, especially on like turns 3 and 4, is that you would, in this scenario, choose to return 2 coppers just to get your deck thin. That's because your deck is going to be expecting a bunch of junk to come into it, because it's an Ambassador game. So you want to get it thin as quickly as possible. So you just pick the option that returns the most junk, basically. Now, Ambassador's very cheap because it costs 3. So if you open with 3 and 4 on your starting 2 turns, you could actually pick up 2 Ambassadors. Should you do that? Now, it's worth noting that if you open double Ambassador, you really aren't going to be able to afford anything at all for a while in that game. If you draw Ambassador every turn to thin, that sounds great, but bear in mind that the only thing in your deck is Ambassadors, Coppers, and Estates, and if you are returning 2 cards, that leaves you with a 2-card hand, and you can't actually buy even a silver. So this has happened to me before. It's sort of like if you open double Steward, which you talked about in the Steward video, you do end up with a lot of these 2 money hands if you open double Ambassador, like if you open double Steward. Now with Steward, you can actually play the Steward as money, and eventually you've got some economy, but this isn't the case with Ambassador at all. So you do just end up hitting 2 a lot. If there are good 2-cost cards, especially ones that can suddenly inject you with a load of economy, like Pixie, then this can actually be pretty strong, because Pixie, as a particular example, it will, you can trash it for 2 silvers, or you can gain a gold, or you can get this money or extra card draw. There's a lot of good stuff that happens. You do have Goat, but you might still want Ambassador anyway, because it's still a junking attack, and it gets you even thinner, quickly. If you don't have these sorts of cards, then what you will probably find is that it's better to try and get your deck drawing and all engine components into your deck, so that you can play the same Ambassador more often, rather than trying to get 2 Ambassadors. The thing with Ambassador is that, while it is tempting to get very thin fast and deal with the junk, you don't want to end up in a situation where that's the only thing that you're doing. You do still actually have to build a functional deck at some point. This is sort of the same thing that we talked about in Chapel with the whole over-trashing thing. At some point, your deck actually has to start doing something. And with Ambassador, you really want card draw. That's because junk is coming in. Ambassador is also lowering your hand size when you play it quite a bit, potentially. So anything that you can do to get your hand size up and get draw is going to be really good. And if you can get that up and running fairly quickly, then you don't necessarily need a second Ambassador straight away, because just playing the 1 Ambassador and getting rid of 2 junk cards every turn is still going to start getting you thin. At some point, you do need to add some economy, so buying a silver with your Ambassador can be pretty good. It's pretty common, at least, or some sort of silver equivalent. The reason for this is because this means you can now sort of hit 3 instead of 2 on some turns, but also with Ambassador, it can be really difficult to hit 5. And if your only draw cards are 5-cost terminal draw, well, you do need to hit 5 at some point. But that's hard with Ambassador, because it's, every time you draw it, you might not be hitting 5 on that turn, especially if you want to be thinning anything as well. So at some point, you should look to basically keep playing Ambassador, but maybe you don't want to return any of those coppers, so this might happen a little sooner than you think. At some point, you do need to actually buy things. And unlike Steward, Ambassador does actually have this option. With Steward, you actually must trash 2 cards, but you don't have to with Ambassador, so that flexibility is nice. Other times when you might want to pick up more than 1 Ambassador, if you feel that you're getting behind and you've had a bad draw, you might worry that you're not going to be able to keep up, so you might add a second Ambassador. So a common situation here is when Ambassador misses the shuffle and it only shows up on turn 5. This is really bad for a lot of cards like Chapel. Generally, if your cards are really strong, shuffle luck is more important in games where the cards are really overpowered, and this is especially true with Ambassador. So, when your opponent, whenever someone plays an Ambassador, you are not just potentially, getting your deck under control by thinning 2 cards, you're also bloating your opponent's deck by 1. So Ambassador snowballs really fast, and that is why if you get a bad draw, you might just decide, okay, it's time, I need to pick up another Ambassador, or otherwise I am just going to fall behind. When you start falling behind with Ambassador, it's very hard to claw your way out just because of the disparity between the two players' decks gets huge very quickly. Like, they get really thin very fast, and you would just bloat your deck very quickly. If you can get ahead, it's worth noting that a second ambassador, if you can play 2 on a turn, this will now give 2 junk every turn to your opponent, and at that point 1 ambassador isn't enough for them to get thin, because you will be adding junk at the same rate that they can thin. So they might then have to get a second one, and if they don't have their deck under control and they can't play those 2 ambassadors every turn like you can, they will just start to fall behind slowly. So if you see this snowballing happening, it's probably a good idea to pick up a second if you've already got your deck drawing. This is another reason why focusing on getting your cards drawn instead of adding a second ambassador right away is really important. As soon as you can get to this state where you're now drawing your whole deck, like picking up a second ambassador can just seal the deal. By basically neutering your opponent from being able to use theirs effectively. So we've talked about how good Ambassador is and why it's just so ridiculously overpowered, but when do you not want Ambassador? When is Ambassador a card that you ignore? And generally, kingdoms tend to need pretty exceptional trashing to make Ambassador not viable. So Ambassador is a very good trashing card by trashing 2, but there are better ones out there. So Chapel and Donate are the usual go-to examples of really good trashing. Masquerade that I've written here is an interesting one. So the thing with Masquerade, is it actually better than Ambassador? This is the old debate that's gone on forever about which one's the stronger card. Masquerade is really good in that it trashes, but it's also draw. So I was mentioning how you need a lot of draw in an Ambassador game to get that up and running fairly quickly. So Masquerade, if Masquerade was on the Kingdom as well as Ambassador, which one would you go for? Because Masquerade, yes, you're going to need like 2 copies if you want to actually get thin, because it's not junking your opponent. But, you have good turns when you play Masquerade, and you're sort of partially there. You're adding draw, so you're building your engine, and you're actually able to buy more expensive cards. So there will be games where, if that feels like the better thing to do, I would pick up Masquerade instead of Ambassador. Just like I need to buy a lot of 5-cost cards. Like maybe my only village is like Festival or something, really expensive or bizarre. So I just need to buy a bunch of copies of them. So I might consider Masquerade just so I have the better turns. But I'll be picking up multiple Masquerades. Right, maybe not 2 straight away. And I can always add an Ambassador later, maybe. Sometimes there's really good defense, like Lighthouse. In that case, your junking isn't really going to work, but it's worth noting that Ambassador is still a good card for thinning your deck. So even in cases where there is really strong defense, you might still get Ambassador anyway. It's also worth noting that a lot of the junk that Ambassador is going to return is copper, and occasionally you get these boards where if you give your opponent a lot of copper, you're actually going to cause them to win. So landmarks from empires like Fountain and Keep, you can suddenly find your opponent getting a big point advantage over you if you give them too many coppers. And that might be a situation where you decide that actually you don't want to junk your opponent and ignore Ambassador, but they have to be really good for that to be the case. If you can junk your opponent really hard and strong, then even the points from Fountain and Keep might not actually be able to catch up with the engine. So, those are not guarantees. And shelters are the big thing, though, that for Ambassador can really hurt it. It's still a good card, but when Ambassador can only remove the coppers and can't remove the shelters, it gets substantially worse. That is because the whole thing of when do you buy other cards gets a lot harder when your deck is got barely any coppers, but it's still got 3 shelters in it. Like, your deck just falls apart very quickly. You have no economy very, very fast if you have shelters. So Ambassador, still good at getting rid of those coppers, still good in the fact that it junks your opponent, but you might not open an Ambassador or get it straight away just because the shelters are going to cause you problems. So here's, with a lot of these attack cards, I try and give advice when you're playing with more than 2 players, whenever I can. A lot of these videos do focus on 2 players, but sometimes there's just more to say. Now, there is a caveat here. While I don't play with more than 2 players that often, I especially don't play multiplayer games with Ambassador. I actually sort of refuse to do it in real life. I really do not like Ambassador games with like 4 players. So while there's a bunch of advice here, bear in mind that my experience with this particular card in more than 2 players is not very high, because I just don't want to play those sorts of games. So, Ambassador is a stacking attack, and it's a junker, and it gets even stronger with more players, and it's already really strong. So Ambassador can be totally dominating and fully define games, even in 2 players, so it's just incredible with more than 2 players. This is an insane card. Now, with junkers, when you've got multiple players, junk gets dished out much faster, but that usually means that it stops coming sooner as well, because the pile's empty. But Ambassador just doesn't stop junking, so you're going to get absolutely flooded with an enormous number of cards if you don't join in. Now, in 2-player, each Ambassador that you have, it removes 2 junk, and you can probably expect 1 to come back from your opponent for each Ambassador that they have. When you have more than 2 players, 1 Ambassador isn't enough to actually keep up with the incoming junk and to actually make your deck size go down. So you actually might consider opening double Ambassador if you're going to be getting a lot of junk coming in. With so many coppers, it can be quite hard to buy anything really decent, because it's not just coppers. You're going to have coppers and little smatterings of other things like estates and ambassadors out there. So you might actually not hit 5 very often. You're just going to have so much of these. Even buying duchies might be tough. So the thing with 4 players is that their games usually tend to go quite fast, and duchies are sort of more important, and you can scrabble for them in some games, but you can actually struggle, in my experience, sometimes in Ambassador games to even hit duchy. Like, if your deck gets absolutely flooded with all manner of junk, you're just sort of going nowhere. It's very difficult to not end up in a situation with a deck that's just overrun with coppers and estates and can't do anything. It's also worth noting, when your deck is really big and filled with junk, your cycling is so bad that it almost feels like it's not actually worth buying anything decent, because you're never actually going to see that card again, right? What do you buy and add to your deck if it takes you 6 or 7 turns to reach your shuffle, right? It doesn't matter what you buy. So what can be good is that it might be worth holding on to estates and then focusing on trying to lower some piles and just win by having more estate points, because no one's actually going to get a deck to a state where they can do anything else. There's a bunch of 4-cost alternate victory cards that can be really nice here. Gardens and Silk Roads are the 2 big ones in these cases. They can be worth quite a bit fairly quickly. Also, you might basically give up on trying to build a functional deck and actually keeping thin with Ambassador and just start loading up on terminal draw cards if you can, especially if you get an early 5, like if you open like with silver, and just try and scrabble for duchies anyway by hoping that you can draw enough coppers when you play your terminal draw to hit 5 and buy them. So that's another thing you can do. Just embrace the junk, right? Just give up on doing anything relevant. And it is also worth noting that when you have a lot more players, when you reveal a card from a pile that's low, it lowers much more rapidly with Ambassador, because instead of just giving out like 1 of those cards, you can give out like up to 3 of them. So you can lower piles very quickly with Ambassador. Yes, sorry, I was just reading. This video so long I've forgotten what I'd written in my presentation. So in 2-player Ambassador, you can have the pile sizes go up. So like if you return 2 estates and 1 is dished out, but that doesn't really necessarily happen in 3 and 4-player. And in 4-player, you can't increase the pile size because you're always going to return more cards than are given back on the pile with each ambassador play. So you can 3-pile sometimes fairly fast with ambassador if things are... you have to actually draw the ambassador with the other card that you want to reveal, of course, but it can happen. And you can even have the copper pile empty. Like, so many coppers are being dished out so quickly that's one of the piles. And then like estates can run as well. And then there's just something else, and there's your 3-pile. So the thing with multiplayer is that if only one person picks up an ambassador, then they're sort of going to end up as the only player who's actually able to do something, because everyone else is going to get junked and they're going to get real thin. So when ambassador is around, it's a good idea to always look to get started with it. So pick it up anyway, and then try and respond to what it is that your opponents do. So if everyone goes all in on ambassador, then it doesn't really matter what you do, your deck is going to fall apart anyway. It's very difficult to actually have a functional deck in a multiplayer ambassador game. So you should look to instead, this is the whole thing where I said, like, give up on actually trying to do anything relevant with your deck, and just load up on like terminal draw cards and try and scrabble for duchies, because you're just not going to be doing very much of anything at all that game. Like, don't try and knuckle down on getting a load more ambassadors. Just say, okay, I'm just going to get a load of coppers and estates, and I'm just going to try and deal with that. In general, with like 3 and 4 player, if all of your opponents are all going for the same strategy, you may find that there's actually something else that you can do that just tries and scrabbles for points and can probably beat them, because you're not competing with them on stuff, and they work together to end the game, basically, and you just rush for points. That's the thing that happens. So this is a pretty long video, so let's go for a quick summary. So this card is very strong. It is thinning and junking together, and it's also ridiculously cheap as well. Because it trashes more than one card from your hand, in the early game, you are not really going to be able to afford very much. You're going to end up just with a load of coppers as well, because that's something that Ambassador dishes out in the States. So you're looking for really cheap cards, like 2-cost cards. They can make Ambassador much stronger by being around. It's really important that you try and get drawing and get your hand size up and cycling, and that is because drawing more will let you actually afford things, and it will also help you draw your Ambassador to keep up with any incoming junk and keep thin. You do not have to return 2 cards every time. You should make sure that you actually do return less cards if you really need to, so that you can afford to actually buy something that turn. Sometimes the value of adding a good card to your deck is going to be more important than the value gained by junking your opponent. There's no point in just trying to junk your opponent forever and never actually have your deck do something. Like, at some point, your Ambassador deck does need to actually transition into a working functional engine. That was the whole point of why you were thinning down and junking your opponent in the first place. So don't be afraid. Maybe you don't do it so much on like turns 3 and 4, but after that, at some point, you know what, it's okay to just reveal cards but not return them. So that was it for Ambassador. What we are going to do now is we are going to head over to the online client, and we're going to generate some kingdoms with Ambassador in it, and we're going to see what we think. But I think the answer is pretty clear. I expect it to dominate all of these. So here we have Ambassador as the only thinning, and we have Bridge and and Mining Village. There is Draw with Wishing Well. Theoretically, Shantytown as well, and there's Moat too. So Moat's actually decent here with Ambassador because it blocks the attack, and it is a form of draw, so we would like to do some Bridge mega turn, but the villages... Well, there is 2 piles, actually, and there is Shantytown. So maybe we actually will get some draw from Shantytown. I would like to play as many bridges as I can, but I think it's going to be kind of tough. I'm going to open with Ambassador, and... What else do I open with? Do I get a warehouse? Is that actually necessary? It might help me, actually, a warehouse to like trigger shanty towns and get draw even later. So maybe I do ambassador warehouse, and I do that just to find my one ambassador a bit more quickly, and then I hopefully have these turns where I can like buy some moats and maybe get some shanty town. Well, I don't know, actually, that doesn't sound very good. Is it just ambassador silver? Is it ambassador bridge? Is it ambassador mining village? It's clear that the cards, I don't see any use for seller with warehouse. Pawn might be fine. Navigate is real bad here. Everything else is fine though. But we're definitely opening ambassador. It's the only thinning, so we'd be crazy not to use it. You're gonna try and draw. I think having a moat or two is actually fine in this deck, but village space is tough. Shantytown's a real bad village for this deck. Because we want everything to be action cards with bridge, so drawing is going to be tricky. It is okay that like even if every other shantytown doesn't give you the draw benefit, it's still giving you like +1 card on average, so it's probably fine here actually, shantytown. So maybe I open ambassador shantytown and I try and use shantytown for extra draw early, and if I draw it alongside ambassador and they collide, well, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, I could have bought a moat, but I'll just buy nothing if they do that. So maybe that's what I do, and then no, but I'm gonna have to get a silver, or maybe a pawn. It can give me some extra money. It's not as good as silver, but it might be able to do that. Yeah, and eventually I want to build the bridge mining village. Anyway, the point is that ambassador is absolutely critical on that kingdom. If you don't go for ambassador, you're mad, and you've really got to win so that you can get that incredible bridge mega turn going. Here we have, looks like a decent engine because we've got laboratory and nobles. So sorry, laboratory is draw. We've got nobles for village. We've also got council room and library as potential draw. I don't like nobles library. I'm much happier with laboratory and nobles. Council room, probably okay to have one here, I guess, but I don't want to be drawing up extra cards while we're still doing the whole ambassador thing. So I definitely want laboratories if I can get them. Now, the only thinning is ambassador, so we have to do it, which we're going to do it anyway, but it's really important here. Is pirate ship a worry with ambassador? I don't think it is. So the problem is that the only village costs 6, which is an outrageous cost, and so you just can't really deal with pirate ship early on. You can't play it alongside ambassador to, well, you're giving them coppers and then you're trashing them for a lot of money. You know what? The pirate ship eventually might be fine as a way to just add payload to your deck, which is interesting, but then again, village space is really tight. And it's a non-drawing village, so I actually don't like that. I think I'd just rather buy some golds, I guess, or have a baron is going to be nicer, because I'm pretty sure I might leave an estate around. In fact, I can leave an estate around, reveal it with ambassador, give one to my opponent, and then like discard it with estate. I'm likely to have an estate at some point, so I would rather junk my opponent with estates rather than coppers anyway. So that seems nice. But yeah, I really want to get ambassadoring, and then somehow I need to try and afford laboratory. Do we bother with Sea Hag? Probably not. We've already got a junker, so whatever. You know, it's a win harder thing if we get it. Are we going to outpost here? Well, you know what? Library is actually fine with outpost. Maybe I can have one library in my deck, and hopefully, well, I've got to get nobles and library together. But once my deck is under control, outpost might actually be quite good. Well, outpost is definitely going to be quite good. I think we can make it work here as well. The draw's actually pretty decent. So, yeah. Anyway, that's that. Ambassador, obviously, key card on that kingdom, and we definitely open with one. I guess I might open Baron Ambassador actually to try and hit 5 and 6 a lot, but I prioritise playing Ambassador if they collide. Here, Now, there is a different treasure on this kingdom, and it's Trading Post, and that's nowhere nearly as good as Ambassador, so we're obviously opening Ambassador. Now, we do have Lurker. That's actually a really good 2-cost card that I forgot about with Ambassador, because it can start gaining me Torturers and Throne Rooms, and because we've got Market as well, and also Lurker, which are non-terminal, we've got a fully blown engine, and we've got it with Throne Room and Torturer. Now, I guess the thing with Torturer is that your opponent can gain curses into their hand, and then they can just give them back with Ambassador, and they actually still get to have 4 other cards in the hand. So I think buying good cards here is not going to be a problem, but early on we're still going to gain Lurkers, and we're going to use the Lurkers to get Throne Rooms and Markets and then Torturers. And we're going to draw up, and we're going to play Outpost, and we're just going to have this crazy engine with Throne Room, Market, Torturer, Outpost, Ambassador, Lurker. I think those are the key cards. Courtyard, maybe we even have a Courtyard or 2, it's fine, but we ignore these cards. We don't care about these 3 over here, and there's just a good engine here. On a 5-2, I still get an Ambassador over Trading Post, I guess. Do I do that? I think I have to. I open Lurker and Ambassador anyway on a 5-2, and I open Lurker and Ambassador on a 3-4. So, okay, so the 5-2 split doesn't matter. Ambassador's just so strong, as it is in all of these kingdoms. Here we have Mining Village and Wharf, so we can draw no problem once we get there. Oh, we got Smugglers as well to go with like Wharf and Village. So Smugglers is going to be really good here. Ambassador is, again, the only thinning, so it is absolutely critical here. We even have Treasure Map to add a load of economy into our deck at some point. And we also have Native Village as a village, which is fine. It costs 2, so we're probably going to get some of them over mining villages at some point. Is Militia good here? I don't think Militia really matters. You don't care if you get hit on your Ambassador turn, and early on you're going to struggle to play it. I think I'm going to open... I wonder if it's actually worth getting the Smugglers right away. Is it actually worth it straight away? I'm not sure that it is. I do want a Smugglers in my deck, but we have to open Ambassador, and I'm just not sure if my opponent's actually going to be buying good cards. And if I get Ambassador and Smugglers collide, I'm going to be playing the Ambassador early on. So I think I open Ambassador Silver, and I look to eventually buy these good cards, Wharf and Mining Village, and I'm going to get Smugglers as well, so that when my opponent joins in on the fun eventually, if they do, then I get to get free copies of these cards. I guess it's worth noting that holding off on the Smugglers is also nice in that if my opponent's ambassadoring doesn't work out and they start drowning in junk and they can't buy anything good, I don't have to bother with the Smugglers because there won't be anything good to smuggle and I can just avoid having it. So, yeah, so this is just a standard Wharf draw engine, and it's got Treasure Map for payload, and we got Ambassador, and we can ignore the other attacks because Ambassador is really good. I mean, I guess if we do eventually get a Wharf Mine Village thing going and our opponent is struggling, we can win harder with Militia. But I'm not actually that worried about Militia early on because it doesn't really impact the Ambassador early on, and that's when Militia's good. You know, and Village Space might be important here. Maybe not. No, I think it's fine, actually, Village Space. I might end up with some native villages, and that will be fine, but I'm not actually that excited about it here. And here comes the last kingdom. So we have Lookout and Salvager as other forms of trashing. Do we care? Ambassador and Ghost Ship and Swindler, there is a lot of nasty attacks here, but rather crucially, there is no village. So that's interesting. So what do we do in the absence of any village? So a part of me wants to do Ambassador, get a silver, and then start buying as many merchants as I can, as quickly as I can. And I'm going to be just chucking junk at my opponent and just play a load of merchants, and that's my first goal. And then eventually I can shift over to markets, and I just have this big cantrip kingdom. And I think this is fairly safe from my opponent trying to do anything funny business. Eventually, maybe I buy a ghost ship and I'd rather attack with that instead? Or maybe a swindler? I don't know. I think Ambassador is going to be the terminal. It's the only terminal I'm going to have, and I want to play it every turn. So I'm going to load up with cantrips and get thin. And that's basically it. That's what I'm going to do. At some point when I buy provinces, how well is my deck going to do? I might need another silver at some point to help out the merchants. Maybe I can swap over to a salvager, and at some point I think I can just stop junking my opponent, and maybe I can swap over to something better. Ghost Ship doesn't feel good, adding terminal draw into a cantrip kingdom with no village. Is Swindler good? I'm not actually that keen on Swindler. I just sort of don't want to give my opponent a curse early on, because that means they're now going to be cursing me with their Ambassador. Salvager's probably fine. Maybe eventually, when I have a spare 4, I can buy a salvager. I can salvage the Ambassador, and I can just start salvaging things to earn a bit more money to just speed up towards the end of the game, I guess. So definitely opening Ambassador here. I think I do Ambassador and silver. I can even see Ambassador Lookout, honestly. It's probably fine. Gets me thinner faster. But another part of me, Mel, just wants to start buying as many merchants as I can. So Ambassador Silver, and then just pick up merchants whenever I can. Probably going to be fine, honestly. That's probably the way to go. And then that puts them in good stead to start buying like markets. I want one at one point and then start getting like double merchant and just run through the merchant pile. So Ambassador, really important. It's like the only terminal that I play for most of the game. It's just so strong. So there you go, that was 5 kingdoms, and as you can see, Ambassador just completely dominated every single one of them, which is absolutely expected. I almost considered not even bothering to do this random kingdom analysis, but I thought that there was probably enough about like how you open and what other things you buy while you're playing Ambassador tennis to make it worthwhile. So yeah, Ambassador, if you didn't realise it was strong, then a real big improvement to your game will be buying Ambassador whenever it shows up. And again, you don't actually want to buy it every single time it shows up, but especially when you're only playing with like these early expansions, it's pretty much going to dominate most games that it's in. So anyway, thank you for watching. I hope that was useful, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.